We've got Andy talking about a novel productivity index for rangelands.
Thank you. And people still look mostly awake, which is good at this time. And I'm going to put a caveat in front about it. I made these slides 2 weeks ago in the rush to get all the bits together for this conference. This is going to follow on the quantile regression theme. I want to take a moment to say that this work was co-led by Guy Lomax, a PhD student who's just finished his project. He can't be here with us today because he's on the other side of the world presenting on another fabulous project on counterfactuals and synthetic control methods at a conference there. And his work was funded by the SRC, and he's doing his postdoc at the moment, but in a few months' time he'll be looking for a job. So if you want someone who's brilliant at doing counterfactuals in a whole bunch of ways in your organizations, there's the clue. So kicking off with a moment of world building, rangelands, for those who might be unfamiliar, largely natural, open landscapes that are used for a lot of grazing and wildlife. This is one of the things that you need to know. A second thing, they're big. Depends on exactly how you slice and dice it, but we're talking about half the terrestrial land surface. And I've gone the wrong direction. They provide ecosystem services that either directly or indirectly support somewhere between 1 to 2 billion people. So a big chunk of the global population depends on the ecosystem services, the provisioning services, particularly the food generating ecosystems. And rangeland condition matters. So there's discourses around degradation, desertification. The narratives are complex. Sometimes they're used by those who have computers and lots of data to say, oh, you should be off that piece of land because you're managing it wrong. So there's things to be wary of about the discourses and the way in which it's expressed and said. But at the same time, if you put an awful lot of livestock in an area and the climate shifts a little bit, maybe you rapidly degrade the grazing resource there in ways that take a very long time to recover. So there's balance with that. And I want to take a moment to say that there's this kind of triangle here, or different things. We should be honest that remote sensing approaches can never tell us everything we might not want to know about rangeland. There are differences in the perception between remote sensing, ecosystem service provision for landscape users, things like forage, fodder on the landscape, and ecological intactness, structure and function. And the rest of this I'm going to be talking about specifically productivity in terms of carbon uptake. So this is one thing that kind of sits between these different domains. We can get a good guess as to carbon uptake from remote sensing, and that links into things about, well, how much is there for livestock to eat in these different places. So these images are taken at the same time of year in 2 different years, in a semi-arid part of Kenya. One just after a particularly anomalously wet season, wet season, one after an anomalously dry season. And any kind of vegetation index, NDVI, any of the like, are all going to tell you, oh, there's really big change here. But what if you've got different interventions in the landscape? People have been attempting to manage the grazing resource, keep a track of their livestock numbers, do things differently in different places, when we've got this enormous temporal variability going on in the underlying kind of biophysical constraints on productivity. There have been a bunch of ways proposed to try to handle this. Most of these next 2 I'm going to touch on, about 25 years old. Rain use efficiency, this idea of how much productivity is there per unit rainfall, and residual trend analysis, res trend, where we can look at fit a linear relationship on a pixel basis, how much productivity you get per unit precipitation, and does your residual, blue lines, red lines, if you plot that over time, is it shifting in one way or another way that might lead you to thinking, okay, we're doing a worse job of managing this patch of land, or we're doing a better job of managing this patch of land, where are things headed? But both of these approaches don't allow you to compare over space. So you can't compare one spatial unit where there might be an intervention, some kind of management project of the kind that many tens of millions of dollars a year gets spent on promoting and implementing globally through a whole bunch of different NGOs and initiatives at a range of scales. there's another approach, local gross primary productivity scaling. Bit of a mouthful. Essentially, you chunk the landscape up into buckets that you think are, this is pretty similar, this unit, and maybe what's the 90th percentile productivity within that unit, and we say, oh, that might be consistent across all pixels within that unit. The more buckets you divvy the landscape up into, the finer the resolution resolving power you've got, but that gives you comparisons in space, not in time. So what we wanted to do, and what Guy did a fantastic job taking forward in his PhD work, is to reconcile this within a single flexible framework. So building up and extending on Elizabeth's brilliant talk, there was a reason I put me after you in the program. Although I didn't pick my talk, that was done independently by others. This is a simplistic relationship. GPP has relationships with annual precipitation. Normally, when we talk about tree-based modelling approaches, we're trying to model a conditional mean of the distribution. That's kind of the bread and butter, the thing we're familiar with. Quantile regression, we might be picking a different quantile, for example, 0.9, that then we're seeking to simulate or understand from the data. And the shape, form of that relationship can often be quite different in quantile regression to what it is with the mean. And sometimes it can allow us to get some insights for something a little bit different. So we use a 90% quantile in this instance to be a little bit insensitive to outliers, those extremities. Maybe there's something going on, maybe someone's irrigating this patch of land, or there's a natural spring with water emerging that's altering these relationships between climatic variables and plant productivity in a given area, so we need to kind of account for those. We can take the ratio between where a pixel's at and that 90 percentile level, and that's our relative productivity index. How well is a given pixel performing relative to what we think it could be performing in this one-dimensional, accounting for annual precipitation. But a lot of things matter in the landscape. There might be annual precipitation, there's grouping within the year, does it all come in one massive dollop and then nothing for the next 364 days? What's the temperature? Things about soil properties like texture that relate to water holding capabilities and things like that. So we took in 16 covariates and we used as our response variable the ML4EO gross primary productivity bit. Happy to talk more about that later, not in the talk. So pull all that together, take a random sample of 1% of the whole study area, about over 2.4 million square kilometers in East Africa, put it through an R-based machine learning pipeline. Something traditionally, an awful lot of machine learning happens in the Python world. A lot of these tools have been ported to different ecosystems. Now there's a massive overlap, so you can a lot of the things that you might want to do, you can do in Python, you can do in R, for an awful lot of it, I think. So training, tuning, quantile regression forest. I'm not going to delve into all the technical details of the cross-validation methodologies we use to account for spatial and temporal autocorrelation, the feature selection stuff, hyperparameter tuning, because we had a version 1 that is published, we've got a version 2 that's about to be submitted, and we've got a version 3 that's in development, and this is one of the pieces that's been developing onwards. We can use that model to predict the potential GPP for every pixel for each year, and then that ratio. Nice simple ratio, yay, that's easy. You start to get outputs like this across the whole area. So RPI equals 1, the unity there, the solid grey line, is equivalent to pixels being on that 90th percentile. 10% of areas above, that's what we expect to see. But where it's interesting is where we start to see this yellow shading on that one. This one, the yellow shading down here, most of the pixels have got very low productivity. This is very low productivity landscapes in terms of a carbon fixation perspective. And this is down to local impact, something locally pulling it down, largely grazing practice, but can also be other things like outbreaks of locust or a whole bunch of other factors. So you've got to interpret them carefully. So it does pretty well in the cross-validation, and if we look at the maps, these ones, column B, this method massively outperforms those rain use efficiency res trend methodologies over 85% of the area. And you see histograms sliding in directions that make you feel better and happier. And on the low, chunking up bits of landscape into different buckets approach, which was the one that can give you spatial insight but not temporal insight, we see often abrupt discontinuities between different buckets that you've chunked the landscape into, whereas if you use random forest quantile regression predictions with a whole bunch of covariates, 16 in the version 1, you can get a much more smooth gradiated transitions across the landscape that are much more plausible, match the reality that you see and encounter. You can do things where you look at the mean RPI over time, the mean RPI over a long period of time, or the trend in RPI using something like a Thielsen estimator robust regression. So is it high? Is it low? Which direction is it trending in? Should we be worried about that? You can then start to slice and dice stuff in different ways with questionable color palettes where you say, is something high and staying high, or low and trending in a good direction? Or was it high and it's trending down steeply? Maybe you want to take a close look if that's happening over a large area, what's going on there. So in summary, RPI works very well. It's already outperforming existing approaches that are used very widely. About 250 publications a year using those methodologies at the moment. Really important for informing landscape management strategies. The quantile regression approach, I think, has wider applicability for many different uses beyond just using models to predict the mean, the conditional mean. So take-home message on that. Got a future development pipeline. Next step is to try to upscale this from our couple of million square kilometre area to global, and disseminating it in dialogue with partners. Now, several partners we're in dialogue with, they're starting to use it for things that matter, to inform really interesting discussions that I'll get into later. Next big bit that we want to do after that is work with stakeholders to develop guidelines for appropriate use. We've got a list of about 3,000 people who are doing work in this space, or using tools like this, or working with NGOs to do work in this space. But this, how do you use the tool, is really important. There's more comprehensive evaluations, which Isaac in the audience is working on as part of his master's project to try and understand a little bit more nuance. Where is this performant? Where is it not working as you expect? To inform those guidelines for appropriate use. And then there's scope for doing improved modelling approaches, more covariates, better covariates, especially around the rain that came last year or the year before, and training strategies. But the bit I want to kind of leave you with on this is the improvement is substantive enough over the existing methodologies. Our priority is to push it out and share it and get it used, and then spend more time tweaking the dials to get it working better. We can definitely get it working better, but that's not the next thing that we need to be paying attention to. But happy to talk about it more. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. That was fascinating. It's very nearly, or it is now probably going to be time to go to the Imperial Bar for some food for those who want to join.
What a way to kill questions.
If anyone has a question they'd love to ask now, quick questions, then we could do a couple and then shoot off. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Andy, one of your slides talked about discontinuity when you were looking in sort of spatial areas. Do you think that's likely to be sort of habitat type, or could it be management legislation around sort of provincial borders, regional, national borders, or even national parks and protected areas versus areas where people are allowed to graze?
Mixture of things, really complex, needs to be unpicked carefully. Big yellow area where RPI is super high, far exceeding expectations, it's actually a wetland. That's why it's really, really high there. Isaac's work is looking at different management areas around Amboseli National Park to understand how different management strategies might be influencing different average states or trends. But then there's a whole bunch of questions you've got to be really careful. Like we've talked around, but don't want to, throw the global protected area data set over this, because there are controversial word, but questions around compliance. You can legally designate an area of land as one thing, and this area of land has a different legal designation or tenure status, but that doesn't actually mean that anything's changed in reality in those places. So this is why the massive consultation exercise is close to my heart as the number 2 thing to do, with lots of people who have insights into shaping the guidelines as to how this should be used and incorporated.
Got 2 more, we'll do those 2 and then we'll call it.
Thank you. And so your study uses random forest model, but because your prediction is that the amount of production, and I am not still familiar with AI models, but did you compare it with diffusion model? I know that diffusion model is also very good at looking at the law.
The fusion model, is that for estimating rangeland cattle productivity per unit area? There's a model with a very similar name.
No, not necessarily specifically for this rangeland, but it is, as long as I am aware, it is good at predicting a very regional rainfall, for example.
I'm struggling to hear. I'm not sure that mic's working.
No, sorry, that's my fault, I think. That should be on, yeah.
Hello.
No, it's still. Well, it's supposed to be on.
Or I can come within earshot.
Yeah. Hang on.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So I just wonder, before you choose random forest, did you look at other possible models? And I am not expert, but I am aware that there is a diffusion model which tends to be used to look at regional precipitation, and as your output seems to be strongly related to precipitation. So I wonder, I would like to know how did you end up using random forest model out of various possibilities?
We took a quick look at a range of model options available to us and liked the flexibility and computational efficiency of the random forest, but particularly the flexibility to represent nonlinear interactions and things in elements. So the diffusion model, I don't think we took a close look at, but I'm not very familiar with it in this context for its applicability to draw in such a range of spatial covariates and support the kind of cross-validation strategies. But maybe there's something for me to learn in that space that you can tell me more about.
Is there one more?
Yeah, me. Thanks. That was really interesting. I'm not sure about asking this question because I might be asking something foolish. But basically, I was wondering, with the potential productivity, it kind of seems like there's an assumption that you could take any location to its potential by making the right intervention. Is that right? But I was thinking maybe that's not going to be the case, or I don't know. How do you know that is the case, that you can?
So, really good question. Not silly question at all. That's kind of getting to the heart of it. Is like, you need to be really careful if you want to use these tools or the predictions made from them from a range of management perspective to understand that you're probably not aiming for to be on RPI 1, but maybe if you're seeing a degrading trend over a 20-year period, that's probably cause for concern. If you're seeing a degrading trend over a 10-year period, that's probably cause for concern. And that's why that guidelines for appropriate use, which we started to get at in the discussions of the existing papers, is important, but we haven't done it sufficiently, drawing on a wide enough range of views from people that we would hope to be picking up and using the outputs from this. And there's a kind of nice use case with some of our partners working in Kenya where their local rangeland managers have greatly increased the stocking density at the same time as there's a positive precipitation anomaly over a multiple year period. So it's all looking groovy right now. If you look from an NDVI-based analysis, you say, hey, yeah, okay, we're flatline. If you look from an RPI analysis, you say, oh, it's going down over the course of several years, because they're telling you slightly different things about the vegetation response to the additional water, if it's a water-limited ecosystem, versus the herbivory pressure from the additional grazing. So those partners who are consultants who work with the rangeland managers in those spaces are already drawing on some of these tools to try and put that into the mix. But it's a really good question.
Thanks.
Brilliant. I think we'll draw it to a close there. And, well, thank you, everyone. It's been a really interesting day. And, yeah, brilliant.